أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وسيد الخلق أجمعين، سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المكرمين الغرر الميامين، سيما بقية الله في الأراضين وحجته على الخلائق أجمعين، سيدنا وإمام زماننا وصاحب نعمتنا وولي أمرنا المهدي الحجة القائم، اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أرواحنا لتراب مقدمه الفداء. My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Let us begin with a prayer that is highly recommended during these holy days and nights, especially during the nights of destiny, Al-Qadr, tonight being the first of those nights. And that is dua al-Faraj. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم وهب لنا رأفته ورحمته وعونه ودعاءه وخيره ورضاه، ما ننال به سعة من رحمتك وفوزا عندك يا كريم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. The topic that I chose for the next few nights is why I am a Shia. A question that we find ourselves asking, especially in the face of challenges and when we find ourselves in situations like this very day, when the followers of the Ahlul Bayt, when the Shia are being massacred across the region, when bombs go off in maternity hospitals that are used primarily by the followers of the Ahlul Bayt, the Shia of the Ahlul Bayt, clearly it begs the question, why are the Shia being killed en masse? Why is it that we have enemies that are so vicious? We have enemies that are so vile. What is it about us that provokes this kind of hatred? Are we somehow contributing to the provocations that are leading to these kinds of massacres? Or is it something inherent to our faith that makes those who are truly vicious expose their hideous nature and reveal their true face and commit such atrocities? These are questions that we find ourselves asking. The media, for example, asks these questions every once in a while. As I said, especially at times of crisis and at times of massacres and acts of terror and whatnot. And if we are not asking these questions at times of crisis, then we should be asking this particular question, the query that I've used as the title of the series, which is, why am I a Shia? What makes a Shia? And I'm not trying to provide a description of who the Shia are. Rather, the more pertinent question that I'm trying to focus on, and I'm hoping to analyze the answers to this question, is why I should in fact be a Shia. Why the Shia school of thought, the school of the Ahlul Bayt, is one that is worthy of being followed. Why the school of the Ahlul Bayt is superior to the school of the Khulafa, the sect that promotes the idea that certain individuals, and only those individuals, get to rule the nation and provide guidance to its followers. And so, again, to sum up, we're trying to find out why the Shia faith is, in fact, worthy of being followed. So, in order to address that question, we're going to have to look at different dimensions of this issue. There are many important reasons as to why I have chosen to be a Shia, and why I know many people who are Shia, and why there are hundreds of millions of people around the world who proclaim and profess the Shia faith, and why I believe the entire world could benefit from the Shia school, from becoming Shia, putting it bluntly. But we will be looking at three main categories of proof. The first will be the intellectual argument. And I will examine why, even without the Holy Quran and the narrations of the Holy Messenger of God, in other words, what is commonly referred to in the Arabic language and in the language of scholars and students of the faith as ad-dalil al-naqli, minus all of that, there is sufficient dalil aqli, meaning intellectual proof, intellectual arguments, to satisfy anyone with a thirst for the proof as to the validity of the Shia faith. I am, of course, primarily addressing Muslims here. In other words, people who follow the school of the Khulafa, as I mentioned earlier. Were I to address non-Muslims, then depending on my target audience, depending on whether or not we're addressing theists or atheists, Christians or Jews or Hindus, or complete agnostics and people who don't believe in the very concept of God, depending on which audience I would be addressing, I would pick different dimensions to discuss. But as I said, as a Shia myself, as a Shia yourselves, I think you can benefit from the discussions that we're about to have. And even if you're not a Muslim, then there are many things to benefit from in this series, God willing. So as I said, the first dimension I will touch upon and discuss is the intellectual argument. Then in the upcoming days and nights, I will discuss the scriptural argument, meaning that we will revisit the primary verses of the Holy Quran that prove unequivocally and without a shadow of doubt the superiority of the Shia school of thought and its primary leader, Ali ibn Abi Talib. Then, following that, we will revisit the primary scriptural references and narrations attributed to the Holy Prophet of Islam in order to make the same case. And so I begin tonight with the intellectual argument. And you might be wondering, is there an intellectual argument to prove the superiority of Ali ibn Abi Talib to all of the other companions? Because remember, the central question that created the schism and the wide divide between the Shia school, the followers of the Ahlul Bayt, from the followers of the Khulafa, albeit they would like to be referred to as Ahlus Sunnah, but I think there's no question that the more accurate description of that school would be the followers of the Khulafa, as opposed to the followers of the tradition of the Prophet. And we will get to why that is later on. But for now, if you hear me say followers of the Khulafa school, I am of course talking about the... So, in order to satisfy this argument that there is an intellectual proof as to the superiority of Amirul Mu'mineen, and therefore the validity of the Shia school in comparison to the school of the Khulafa, allow me to begin with a story. And the story goes something like this. One day a woman, she lived in Iraq. And the governor of Iraq at the time was Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi. Al-Hajjaj, many of you are familiar with him. There's no reason to delve into his history or his mindset. A tyrant by any standard. Possibly one of the most vicious despots that at least Islamic history has ever witnessed. This woman goes and she's granted an audience with Hajjaj. She enters the governor's mansion, the palace where he resided. And the first thing that strikes Hajjaj about this woman is that she refuses to look him in the eye. She refuses to raise her head when she's addressing him. So he takes offense to that. He says to her, "Why are you not raising your head? Why don't you look at me?" So she said to him with an incredibly firm resolve and the kind of bravery that only a follower of Ali ibn Abi Talib would exhibit, especially in the court of a tyrant who was known for how thirsty he was for blood and the murder of completely random and innocent individuals. Again, there are many stories that describe his tyranny. I don't want to go there now. She responds when he says to her, "Why don't you look at me?" She says to her, "Because I refuse to look at a face, the looking at which is forbidden by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala." In other words, I don't want to spoil and corrupt my eye by setting it on your hideous face. In other words, you should know who I am and understand that I do not regard you as a man worthy of respect in any way or form. So he immediately recognized that this woman must be a Shia. This woman can't just be a random villager. And so the conversation then ensues. And it goes from one topic to another. Eventually, at some point, he says to her, "You follow Ali ibn Abi Talib. You love your so-called commander of the faithful. But tell me, how do you know Ali is better than Uthman, the third so-called Khalifa?" The woman immediately exhibits what could only be described as utter disgust. She says to him, "Are you kidding me? Are you joking right now? You're comparing the commander of the faithful, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Amirul Mu'mineen, to Uthman of all people?" She said to him, "I believe, if you're trying to probe my beliefs and you're trying to find out what I believe in, well, let me set the record straight. I believe that Ali ibn Abi Talib is better than all of God's prophets, apostles, and messengers, let alone Uthman. He said to her, come on, you believe Ali is better than the prophets of God? She said, yes, and I have the proof to present you with. He said, well, what is your proof? She said to him, look at Prophet Ibrahim. In the Holy Quran, God tells us a story. You're all familiar with it. I don't want to go there. But essentially, Ibrahim says to God, I wish for you to show me how you resurrect the dead. The Quran describes it as such. وَإِذْ قَالَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ رَبِّ أَرِنِي كَيْفَ تُحْيِي الْمَوْتَى قَالَ أَوَلَمْ تُؤْمِنْ قَالَ بَلَى وَلَكِنْ لِيَطْمَئِنَّ قَلْبِي. God says that Ibrahim said, O Lord, show me how you raise the dead. He said to him, meaning God, do you not believe? Do you lack faith? In other words, I've told you I will raise the dead on the day of judgment. Why do you have to see it? Ibrahim said in response, he said, yes, I do believe. وَلَكِنْ لِيَطْمَئِنَّ قَلْبِي. But I wish for my heart to find peace and rest. In other words, I wish to have certainty. I know that you can do it theoretically. But if I see it in action, then I will believe it with absolute certainty. This is what Ibrahim did, she said to Hajjaj. Ibrahim needed physical proof in order to believe in this and to have certainty. Now let's find out the kind of certainty that Ali ibn Abi Talib had. She said to him, have you not heard that Ali said, Wallah law kushifa li al-ghita mazdadtu yaqina. By God, if the veils were lifted, in other words, if there was nothing separating this corporeal, physical world from the next, if the veils were lifted, my certainty would not increase, not even an iota. In other words, Ali has such certainty that he needs no more proof. Ali needs no physical proof. Ali's certainty has reached its uppermost level. Ibrahim says, I need proof. Ali says, I don't need any more proof. That's for Ibrahim and Ali. As for Sulaiman, she said to him, Sulaiman says in the Quran, رَبِّ هَبْ لِي مُلْكًا لَا يَنْبَغِي لِأَحَدٍ مِّن بَعْدِي. Oh Lord, give me a kingdom, give me a dominion, give me a nation, give me power and authority that shall never be given to anyone after me. Allahu Akbar. And so, this is what Sulaiman says to God. Now let's see what Ali says about dominion and authority and kingdoms. Ali said when he became the leader of over 50 of today's nation, he said, Ya dunya غري غيري فقد طلقتك ثلاثا ولا رجعة لي إليك أبدا. Ali said, O dunya, O earthly world, I have divorced you thrice. You are divorced. And I shall never come back to you ever again. Because we know that in Islam, when a couple are divorced 3 times in a row, without them remarrying, without them marrying other people, what happens is they're no longer allowed to come back together. Their divorce will be permanent. Sulaiman says, oh God, give me a dominion that no one will ever have. Ali says, I don't want dominion. I don't want this world. I don't want this khilafah. When he was a khalifa, it's easy to say, I don't want to be the president or the king or the queen or this or that when you don't have it, right? But when you actually have it and you say, I don't want it, I'm not in any way intrigued or entertained or pleased by this, that is something only someone like Ali ibn Abi Talib could say. So that's the difference between Sulaiman and Ali ibn Abi Talib. As for Isa, this woman says to Hajjaj. Hajjaj said, stop. You're not actually going to tell me that Ali is better than Jesus now, are you? This is Jesus after all we're talking about. This is Ali ibn Abi Talib. This is Jesus, the Spirit of God. This is Jesus, the one who used to raise the dead, the one who used to cure the leper and the blind. This is the one that God created as His Spirit by Himself. And yet you tell me Ali is better than Jesus? She said to him, it's not like you're teaching me something I don't know. Who are you to teach me about my beliefs and to teach me about the grandeur of prophets and messengers? She said to him, I know all of these things, and I'm saying what I'm saying based on my knowledge of all of these things that you just mentioned, and then some. She said to him, Jesus was an incredible person. كلم الناس في المهدي صبيا. He was a young infant, just born, and yet he spoke eloquently while in the crib. Jesus was all of these things that you mentioned. But don't you also acknowledge that when Jesus was about to be born, the angels came down. His mother, the Virgin, Blessed Mary, was going through convulsions and she was going through labor. And yet the angels came down and she said to her, Qumi, get up. هذه دار عبادة وليست دار ولادة. This is a mosque. This is a place of worship. This is where people come to do acts of devotion and supplicate for God. This isn't a maternity ward. This isn't a place where women come to give birth. Get up and go. Which is why God says in the Quran, listen carefully. He says, وَاذْكُرْ فِي الْكِتَابِ مَرْيَمْ إِذْ انْتَبَذَتْ مِنْ أَهْلِهَا مَكَانًا شَرْقِيًّا. Remember in the book Mary, who withdrew from her family and went to a location in the east. Now, some of you might already know that this particular verse is in reference to a specific place that is not in Bethlehem. It is not in Jerusalem. But we'll leave that for another day, inshallah. Maryam was told to leave the house of worship, Al-Baytul Maqdis, because this is a place of worship and devotion and supplication. Go somewhere else to give birth to your child. And yet, don't you also acknowledge, O Hajjaj, that Ali's mother, Fatima bint Asad, was circumambulating the house of Allah, the Kaaba, the most blessed place on earth, which is more blessed and more sacred than Masjid al-Haram, and Masjid al-Aqsa, that is. She was circling the house of the Lord, and when she went into labor, God opened His own house in order for the mother of Amir al-Mu'mineen to give birth to him right inside His blessed house. So you tell me, who is better, Ali or Isa? Ali or Ibrahim? Ali or Sulaiman? Ali or Nuh? Ali or Adam? And you're asking me, who's better, Ali or Uthman? Who's better, Ali or Omar? Who's better, Ali or Abu Bakr? Are you kidding me? Are you joking right now? Brothers and sisters, as we embark on this journey, inshallah, and answer this very central question, which is, why am I a Shia? The first thing we need to do is establish the intellectual proof for why Ali was superior to everyone after the Holy Messenger of God. The Holy Prophet was, of course, the greatest creation that God created and His most blessed gift for the entire world. There's no question there. But we need to establish unequivocally and without a speck of doubt that in fact Ali was superior to everyone else, bar the Prophet. And as I said earlier, we're going to do this by first establishing the intellectual proof for that. In other words, once again, setting aside the Holy Quran, setting aside the quotes and words and injunctions of the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, setting all those things aside, can we establish an intellectual proof, a historical proof? Because we could go on and on about all the verses in the Quran which establish Ali's superiority to everybody else. And we could go on and on about the prophetic traditions that Ali was superior to everybody else. But what about the historical proof and the intellectual proof? In order to do that, let me mention a very important point, which is that if we prove Ali's superiority to everybody else after the Prophet, it should come as self-evident that once the Prophet has left this world, the entire nation and people who proclaim the religion of Islam to be their chosen faith have no choice but to follow Ali ibn Abi Talib. If we have a problem with that point, then we need to have a very different conversation. Because there are people who say that sure, Ali ibn Abi Talib was a great person. Yes, he might have been better than the other companions. However, that doesn't mean anything. And that ultimately you can be superior, you can be better. But who you should follow after the Prophet is a matter that's contingent upon other things. For example, if the nation chooses someone else, in spite of their inferiority, then everybody has to follow them. However, those who make this argument are a tiny minority. They are a very small, negligible minority. Why? Because on the one hand, they do have enough courage to acknowledge and confess that Ali ibn Abi Talib was superior to everybody else. But at the same time, their biases and their affiliations and their tribal connections and the fact that my daddy was a follower of the Khulafa, my mommy was a follower of the Khulafa, all these prejudices and biases push them to the other side. So their mind is telling them Ali is better. He should have been the successor of the Prophet. But their biases and their whims and their desires and their temptations and their tribal affiliations push them to say that no. Sure, Ali was better. Sure, Ali was superior. But the nation chose a different person. And so we follow whatever others chose. So among these people are individuals like Ibn Abi al-Hadid al-Mu'tazili, the one who wrote the famous commentary on Nahj al-Balagha. He says from the very beginning of his book, which as I said is a commentary on Nahj al-Balagha, from the get-go, he says, look, Ali is better than all of the Khulafa. However, God, because of his wisdom, chose for the inferior to lead the superior. At least he's honest that Ali ibn Abi Talib was superior. The problem is, he then immediately contradicts God's wisdom. And better yet, or worse yet, chooses to refer to the wisdom of God. Because if God is wise, and of course we all acknowledge that he is, then why would he have the inferior lead the superior? Does that make any sense at all? For God to say, I have this option, which is better in every way, but I wish for you to follow this option. And in fact, the better option has to follow the lead of the worse option. It makes absolutely no sense. It runs contrary to the intellect and let alone to religion. So, that's why I said those who make such an argument are a tiny, minuscule minority within the Muslim nation. As for the majority, the followers of the school of the Khulafa, they make a very different argument. And this is very critical for all of you to understand as we progress in this discussion. What do they say? They say that in fact, superiority and inferiority is determined by the line of succession and, more ridiculously still, the chronological order that the Khulafa came in. In other words, put very simply, they say Abu Bakr was the first Khalifa, therefore he was the better candidate for the position. Then Umar, and he was number 2. Then Uthman, he came 3rd. Then Ali ibn Abi Talib. The biggest proponents of this theory are, in fact, the Salafi / Wahhabi / Takfiri Muslims. But now this has become mainstream. This, in fact, has turned into the mainstream belief of the vast majority of people who follow the school of the Khulafa. Once we understand this, the next logical step is for us to prove once and for all that Ali ibn Abi Talib was the undisputed, superior individual after the Holy Prophet of Islam. Because naturally, once you make that argument, the majority of Muslims who follow the school of the Khulafa will have no choice but to now follow Ali ibn Abi Talib and to subscribe to the Shia school of thought. Hence the question, why am I a Shia? So, with all of that introduction, the point of this entire discussion, my very dear brothers and sisters, and I know we have viewers who are watching us live now on YouTube and Facebook, and they'll be watching us on Ahlul Bayt television around the globe. May Allah bless you all, and thank you for joining me on this incredibly pivotal and important night, the eve of the 19th of the month of Ramadan, a night that is the first of the nights of destiny, and a night in which God revealed His written Quran, and also a night in which the spoken Quran, the Quran in action, the partner to the Quran, the one who's equal to the Quran, Ali ibn Abi Talib, will descend to the heavens. It's a night in which the commander of the faithful was assassinated. It's a night in which the Imam, the one about whom we are talking and whose superiority we will prove, this Imam was struck on the eve of the 19th of the month of Ramadan. He was struck by a sword that was poisoned not just with physical poison. It was in fact poisoned with hate. It was poisoned with prejudice. It was poisoned by decades, almost 30 years in fact, of character assassination against the commander of the faithful. The sword had been prepared over 3 decades ago. The sword of Ibn Muljam was being sharpened from the day of Saqifah. Don't be surprised to see Ali ibn Abi Talib being killed while all alone as he prayed in his mihrab, as he prayed in his niche inside Masjid al-Kufa. Don't be surprised that Ali ibn Abi Talib had been left all alone. Because this conspiracy, brothers and sisters, was the product of decades of character assassination, decades of dehumanization, decades of attacking Ali ibn Abi Talib in every conceivable way, and comparing him with people who were not even equal to the slippers on the feet of his slave Qambar, let alone people who could be compared in any way with the virtues of Ali ibn Abi Talib. قاسوك أبا حسن بسواك وهل بالطود يقاس الذر أنا ساووك بمن ناووك وهل بالطود يقاس الذر. These are the beautiful verses of poetry by Sayyid Rida al-Hindi al-Gharawi al-Najafi Ridwanullah ta'ala alayh, in his famous diwan, in his famous qasida known as the Kawthariyya, in which he tells the story of Ghadir, and he speaks of the morals of Ali ibn Abi Talib, and he says, Fas'al, actually going back a few verses before, so beautiful how he articulates the virtues of Ali ibn Abi Talib. He says, يا من قد أنكر من آيات أبي حسن ما لا ينكر إن كنت لجهلك للأيام جحدت مقام أبي شبر فاسأل بدرا واسأل أحدا وسل الأحزاب وسل خيبر من دبر فيها الأمر ومن أردى الأبطال ومن دمر من هد حصون الشرك ومن شاد الإسلام ومن عمر من قدمه طه وعلى أهل الإسلام له أمر قاسوك أبا حسن بسواك وهل بالطود يقاس الذر أنا ساووك بمن ناووك وهل ساووا نعلي قنبر. Sayyid Rida al-Hindi says, if you deny the virtues of Ali ibn Abi Talib, يا من قد أنكر, you who challenge the superiority of Amir al-Mu'mineen, come here, I want to tell you a story. How could you deny these virtues if you are ignorant of his actions, of his campaigns, of his sacrifice, of his great work? If you're ignorant, you deny the status of Ali ibn Abi Talib based on your ignorance, then go and ask Badr, the battle in which there was only one hero and one hero alone, and that was Ali ibn Abi Talib. فَاسْأَلْ بَدْرًا وَاسْأَلْ أُحُدًا. Ask Uhud, where everybody left the Prophet. The Messenger of God was abandoned by every so-called Muslim until his teeth broke. And there was only one person who defended the Prophet, and that was none other than Ali ibn Abi Talib. فَاسْأَلْ بَدْرًا وَاسْأَلْ أُحُدًا وَاسْأَلِ الْأَحْزَابِ وَاسْأَلْ خَيْبَرَ. And we'll get to Ahzab later on, inshallah. And ask Khaybar. Ask about the one who plucked out the gates of this fortress and used it as a bridge for the Muslims to march into the fortress and take it. Ask these battles and ask these pivotal moments in history so you'll get a sense of who Ali ibn Abi Talib was. من دبر فيها الأمر ومن. Who was the commander? Who was the leader? Who was the warrior in all of these battles that saved Islam from the brink of annihilation? وَمَنْ أَرْدَ الْأَبْطَالَ وَمَنْ دَمَّرَ. Who was it that challenged and killed the greatest mythical heroes of the Arab nations, other than Ali ibn Abi Talib, in spite of his young age? مَنْ هَدَّ حُصُونَ الشِّرْكِ وَمَنْ. Who was the one who tore down the fortresses of idolatry and raised instead Islam in their position? Man qaddamahu taha wa ala. Who was the one appointed by the Prophet to go lead the Muslims in more than one occasion? Ala ahli al-iman lahu ammar, and made him the commander of the faithful. Qasuka Aba Hasan. O Aba al-Hasan. O commander of the faithful. They compared you with others. But how can you conceivably compare a tiny grain of sand with the highest mountain? How can you do that? Isn't that comparison in and of itself ludicrous? Isn't that a farcical